Hello, welcome to the LaSalle Public Library's virtual programming. This is Donna Blomquist, librarian at the LaSalle Public Library, welcoming you to tonight's program about a favorite son of Illinois, Everett Dirksen. Before we start tonight's program, I just want to make quick announcements on 3 upcoming programs. They're on your screen now. Exploring Starved Rock. This program will be Mark Walsinski. For many of you who are in the area, Mark is kind of a fixture in history and in everything there is to know about Starved Rock State Park. Mark will be with us talking about his hiking and driving guide through the park. He, as a IDNR state police officer stationed at the park for many years, knows pretty much every inch of it, and would like to share that with folks. His book, A Little Hiking Guide about the park, was part of a fundraiser for the Starved Rock Foundation. We'd love to have you tune in for this program. It's next Tuesday at 6 o'clock, and we hope to see you there. The next program is the following week on the 26th, and this one we've been advertising for a while now. Author Kate Moore, who was a runaway acclaim with her Radium Girls book, has written another nonfiction account taking place in Illinois, The Woman They Could Not Silence. She will be with us from London on the 26th, 2 p.m. It's Saturday, so difference in the calendar. This is a fascinating book that takes us from Jacksonville and Manteno all around the state, even to places throughout LaSalle County, as well as Putnam County and over by Kankakee. So it's something to listen to and be fascinated by. Quite a story about a strong woman who had a story to tell and told it. And finally, our newest program that we have shown on the screen is the Social Graces. This program will be on July 13th at 6 o'clock. Author Renee Rosen will talk about the history and her interest in writing about the Gilded Age in her new historical fiction novel, Social Graces, the story of the rivalry between the Astors and the Vanderbilts. So we hope you'll mark your calendar for that and be with us for that program also. Tonight, we are welcoming Tiffany White, director of the Dirksen Congressional Center, and her presentation of Senator Everett Dirksen's humble upbringing and his national legacy. This program is made possible through a grant from the Illinois Humanities Council. We would like to call your attention to our short little survey that'll pop up right at the end of Tiffany's program, and also the humanities survey that will be sent to you via email. If you could please answer both surveys, they're very brief. We really appreciate it. We count on the Humanities Council and these grants, and they would like to have feedback, and we appreciate that. So thank you very much for joining us tonight. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and my microphone and welcome Tiffany. Tiffany, are you there? And we see you.
I am.
And we hear you. There you go.
Good. Okay, very good. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to come and speak to you. I am the director of the Dirksen Congressional Center, which is located here in Pekin, Illinois, which is the place that Dirksen was born and raised. And the Dirksen Center started out as sort of a library and museum for Dirksen's papers about a decade after his death and service in Congress. It has evolved over the course of several decades to what it is today. And what it is really a world-class academic research institution. Our mission is to enhance the public's understanding of people, enhance the public's understanding of Congress, its people, and its policies. And we do that primarily through facilitating academic research through our own congressional collections, but also through a grant program that we have had for many, many years now. And to date, the Congressional Center has issued up to about $1.8 million in congressional research grants. So we fund research on Congress by professional scholars who may not be accessing our own records, but who are nonetheless studying Congress and doing work that very much coincides with our mission. I am new to the center. I've been here for not quite 2 years, and I am not a historian or an archivist by trade. My background and experience comes from working in legislative government. I worked for 5 years in the 18th District Congressional Office in Illinois, which represented the same area that Dirksen represented when he was in Congress. And then after that, I had a short stint doing leadership in a not-for-profit organization here in Pekin, and then got pulled back into legislative government when a local state representative needed help on his staff. And so I served as his chief of staff for about 4 years, during which time I was also on the Dirksen Center Board of Directors, and our longtime director, Frank Mackman, was trying to move into retirement, or at least semi-retirement. And so I was approached by the board to fill his shoes, which is hard to do. And I'm certainly doing things a little bit differently than he did, but I'm very excited to be here at the center, and blessed to have a great staff that has also been here for a really long time. And we continue to do really, really great work, not just in our community, but all across the country. I'm going to show you a little video that will serve as an introduction to my presentation, and it kind of gives you an inside look to the center and what I do and what my days look like, and why I'm so passionate about both studying Dirksen as a part of my vocation as well as sharing his story. So if you'll bear with me for just a moment, I am going to share my screen and give you this inside look. And after that, I will go right into my presentation. Dirksen was farm town of Pekin, Illinois, to first-generation German immigrants, and under circumstances required.
Tiffany, we're not hearing your volume.
Oh.
Tiffany, it might be a good idea to restart the video. Would that work for you?
Can you hear me, Donna?
I can now.
Okay. It looks like I had a brief internet connection interruption. I will try one more time if that's okay with you. And if it does
Sure.
not work, then I will just move forward.
Okay.
There may be something about the video sharing that is taking up a little too much data. So let's try this once more.
Okay.
Dirksen was born in the town of Pekin, Illinois, to first-generation German immigrants, and that absolutely
It does not appear that it's going to work for us.
and more than Can
We can
you hear
see
me?
your screen, but we cannot hear it. But we can see you.
Okay, am I back?
You are back and your audio is fine.
Okay, I apologize, everyone. I will send you a link to this if that would be helpful. If anybody wants to see the whole video and again get a little inside look of what the center is like, then you can do that after the program. Apologize for the technical difficulties on that, but let me just jump right in here and start off by saying that, you know, many people of all ages have at least heard the name Everett Dirksen, and rightfully so. His name is on street signs and federal buildings in Illinois, and the Senate office building in Washington, D.C. is also named after him. And though he hasn't served in the US Senate since 1969, the year that he died, he is still often quoted by today's public figures. The most famous quip attributed to him is "a billion here, a billion there, and pretty soon you're talking real money." It's an oft-used sentiment to caution against runaway government spending. And I'll let you in on a little secret. There's actually no solid proof that Dirksen ever said that in those exact words. Although, in all fairness, he probably did say it in those words at some point. He said similar things to that. It sounds like something that he would say, but not even the Dirksen Center can locate that exact quote. And yet I get a Google alert at least once a week from somebody who is quoting Dirksen by saying that. Dirksen's most impactful claim to fame, something that we do know for certain is true, was that he was instrumental in helping pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The simple fact is that the Civil Rights Act would not have been a reality if not for Dirksen, and there are myriad reasons for this. At the time, he was serving as the Senate's Republican minority leader when Southern Democrat Lyndon Johnson was president. The Democrats possessed the majority in all of Congress, too. In fact, based on the numbers, Democrats could have single-handedly passed the act if they so wanted. But the problem, of course, as I'm sure that you all well know, and something that's unfamiliar to us today, is that the division on civil rights policy was not between Democrats and Republicans, but it was instead between Northerners and Southerners. And the Southern Democrats, many of whom were unapologetic segregationists, possessed a truly impressive amount of power in Congress. As such, President Johnson's only avenue for passing the legislation was by bringing a significant number of Republicans aboard, and he did just that thanks to his friendship with Dirksen and thanks to Dirksen's own set of unique and impressive political talents. And something that I mentioned in the video that I will mention to you now is that Dirksen and Johnson didn't just get along for business's sake. They were truly good friends and close confidants. And that has been intriguing to me because if you look at their personalities and the way in which they accumulated power and made a difference, they had two very different styles. And yet, again, they didn't just go along to get along. They were really good friends. And that makes such a difference when you're talking about trying to get something across the court like this. And I know from my own experience in legislative government, as well as the way in which I've tried to study it critically from the outside, that when you're trying to pass this type of sweeping legislation, successfully whipping votes and keeping them whipped, more importantly, takes an incredible amount of skill, impeccable timing, experience, the ability to plan ahead and anticipate, and certainly the right kind of temperament. It takes someone who knows how to build and maintain relationships. That was Dirksen. Furthermore, Dirksen's own family history and upbringing in Central Illinois served as a foundation for him to become truly passionate about issues like civil rights and even voting rights. In response to a reporter's question about why he had taken such a lead role in the Civil Rights Act, he remarked, "I come from German immigrant stock. My mother stood on Ellis Island as a child of 17 with a tag around her neck directing that she be sent to Pekin, Illinois. Our family had opportunities in Illinois, and the essence of what we're trying to do in the Civil Rights Bill is to see that others have opportunities in this country. Now more than ever, and particularly in this time of modern history where racial tensions are higher than they have been in recent memory, it seldom escapes me that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was easily one of the most consequential pieces of legislation passed in the 20th century, and that it cannot be taken for granted. For this alone, Dirksen deserves to have his name and his legacy live on into perpetuity. But when you start to peel back the layers of Dirksen's personal story and the path that fate led him on, that to me is where so much of this real intrigue lies. And it's something that I have really felt drawn to internalize. Like I said, in so many ways, Dirksen represents our most romanticized ideal of the American dream, that you can come from anywhere and become anything, that you can be born of no significance, but through hard work, dedication, and a little bit of luck, you can die a person of truly remarkable significance. And so with that, I will take you back to 1896, the year that Dirksen was born. He was born to his mother and father here in this quaint and unassuming quasi-farm town of Pekin. Dirksen's mother was originally from the German village of East Frisia, which was called Ostfriesland. Why did mother come to the United States in the first place? Dirksen poses this question in his autobiography, and he responds to it by saying, the answer is quite easy. A number of others from the same general area in Germany had migrated to this country some years before, and they were quick to write to their friends in the ancestral land and tell them what magnificent adventure it was to live in a free country. Both mother and father had lived under the rule of the German Kaisers and knew full well that no matter how benevolent a Kaiser might be, it was still an imperial dictatorship with all of its paternalism and constricted freedom. Dirksen's mother married her first husband soon after she arrived in the United States, but he died rather young. However, they had brought 2 boys into the world before his death. His mother then married Dirksen's father, who was a bit older, and they brought 3 more boys into the world, including Dirksen and his twin brother. But sadly, when Everett was only 5, his father suffered a stroke that left him virtually incapacitated until his death. That left Mrs. Dirksen, a widow once more, now with 5 boys to raise, all on her own. And it's worth noting that Everett's parents' decision to court one another initiated when they had learned that they were both from that same village in old Germany. So the power of heritage seemed to be very significant for these Germans like the Dirksens. Dirksen idolized his mother for her strength and her steadfast skill in raising him and his brothers, and under such very difficult circumstances. She was a tireless worker, she was stoic and principled, and she was deeply religious. In fact, she quite literally helped build the Second Reformed Church of Pekin with her own hands. And this example of hers left a deep and everlasting impression upon Dirksen that can really be seen in one way or another throughout his entire personal and professional life. For example, when he was a member of Congress during the Great Depression and considering the onslaught of New Deal legislation as a member of, the fiscally conservative minority party, he specifically recounted how his mother had been left with a brood of youngsters and there were just no relief agencies in sight. But the family knew, however, that there was one way to get relief, and that was just to work. So to people who were brought up in this fashion, in this environment, some of the New Deal proposals were just simply unconscionable. Specifically, the one that paid money out of the public purse to reduced farm acreage, that would artificially bring about scarcity. He couldn't support things like this because of the way that he was raised. And he talked about that when he was opposing such pieces of legislation. That being said, he was in favor of the vast majority of New Deal packages, but nonetheless, like I said, his upbringing required him to question some of those other pieces, and he spoke very openly about that. But back to Pekin in his early days, the Dirksens lived in a very quaint and unassuming part of town that earned itself the nickname of Bonschviertel, which translates loosely to Beantown in German. And it got the name in part from its heavy settlement of first-generation German immigrants, but also because those immigrants grew all of their own vegetables and even maintained small livestock on their properties, which were not very big at all. Even as a young boy, too, Dirksen would wake up before the sun came up to start his gardening chores at 5 a.m. Incidentally, but not by accident, this is also when he would start his legislative chores as a U.S. Senator, and it made a huge difference in his career. It resulted in him being able to put in the extra hours necessary to really study and understand the legislative process and all of its nuances. And that knowledge is what helped Dirksen place his influence on literally every piece of successful legislation. He took the time afforded to him by these long days to actually read and contemplate all legislation being considered. And if he didn't like it, he could certainly help make it better, even if he couldn't stop it from becoming the law of the land. And that's exactly what he did. To everything, there was a Dirksen amendment. Working hard and tirelessly was just a badge of honor for German immigrants, but also a necessary means of making a living. It's just how they got by. The Dirksen lifestyle was a meager one, but it was a faithful one. They were poor, to be sure, but Dirksen insists that throughout his entire childhood, he never felt as though he wanted too much for anything. And for this, he gives his mother a great deal of credit. There was a certain ruggedness about life, Dirksen recalls, of his youth. He said, and a certain ruggedness of living that life. His biographer, Neil McNeil, elaborates on that by saying, like the houses of their neighbors, the Dirksen home had its very own parlor, and it was used only on Sunday. On the parlor floor lay a Brussels rug, then the height of mid-American fashion, and there they kept the pictures of their relatives. Against the wall stood a horsehair sofa, and in the middle of the room was a marble-top table. And on that table, Dirksen recalled years later, was the big book, and you opened the big book in those days. Luckily for Dirksen, his aptitude for learning as well as his aptitude for oratory were apparent at a very early age, well before high school even. And he ended up being the only one of his brothers to attend high school, which at the time was a truly unique privilege. The other brothers dropped out of school a bit earlier to work, which was completely normative for the times. But Everett got his mother's blessing to go to high school, in part because she wanted him to utilize his natural gifts, with reading and oratory to go into ministry. Of course, he didn't end up doing that. But along the way, what he did gain a special interest for was the theater, and he would have really loved the pursuit of acting. His mother, though, being the strict German Calvinist that she was, begged him not to go that far, and he obliged her. And it always makes me smile when I tell this story because, it seems like, Everett and his mother both got their way when he went into politics, because politics in so many ways is basically just equal parts acting and sermonizing. But he didn't get into politics right away. He graduated from high school and he really just kind of floundered around for a bit because he didn't have a clear picture of what it was that he wanted to do. He then reconnected with a cousin of his from Minnesota who persuaded him to visit him and consider going to college there and studied law. And that's what he did. But soon thereafter, the war broke out and he enlisted, and he never did go back to college. Instead, he came back to Pekin when World War I was over. He got jobs here and there, like at places like Corn Products, which is still in business here in Pekin. He worked on a dredging barge and later spent some time working with his brothers for the family bakery. And that's a position that he actually kept all throughout his tenure as a member of the Pekin City Council, which, by the way, was his first foray into politics. So he spent 4 years serving as the Commissioner of Finance on the Pekin City Council, and then he decided that he was going to run for Congress, and he did so unsuccessfully. But then 2 years later, he ran again, and he won, and he was basically just off and running on the track of national prominence. So he spent nearly 4 decades in Congress, first in the House and then in the Senate, starting in 1951. He was a Republican, in part due to the time and place and circumstance under which he was born into the world. At the turn of the 20th century, Central Illinois was not just an ideologically conservative stronghold, but there was a uniqueness to its Republicanism because this was and still largely is Lincoln country. Pekin was the seat of Tazewell County, still is, and as such, the site of the county courthouse. It was a town known to Abraham Lincoln for just about all of the years of his adult life, and many significant accomplishments in his early career involved Pekin. So this was a place where Lincoln had many friends, and when Dirksen was a boy, there were men and women in this town who had known Lincoln all of his life and who had known him quite well. That simple but profound fact pervaded life in Pekin, and Dirksen just grew up with it. In fact, Dirksen grew to idolize Lincoln so much that he even started to perceive endless parallels between Lincoln's early life and career and his own. On the desk behind me, which is Dirksen's desk from his DC office, there are a few of Dirksen's original books about Lincoln, and it's not hard to see that they were well read and often referred to. And I truly believe that this connection that Dirksen made with Lincoln, the man, the politician, the person of great historical significance, probably enhanced his passion for civil rights even more. For Lincoln Republicans of the day, I think that any form of racial injustice seemed innately personal. And there's a certain sense of righteousness about having been on the right side of history with these issues in the past that made those flames burn much brighter and much stronger. When slavery was abolished, everyone knew that the American dream and true equality of opportunity were not going to happen overnight, but 100 years was an eternity in this regard. And I think that, in the 1960s, when things really, really started to become unrestful, I think that many Republicans were able to conceptualize their support for the Civil Rights Bill as their contribution to Lincoln's still unfinished business. So Dirksen, with his great affinity for Lincoln, advocated for civil rights and voting rights in a number of ways throughout his career. And so by the time it came to be where the outside movement joined with the inside power in the civil rights efforts of 1964, Dirksen would proudly proclaim that he was no Johnny-come-lately to the cause. Something that I would like for all groups to understand and appreciate about Dirksen and his legacy is that the intense racial turmoil of the early 1960s alone did not make the Civil Rights Act inevitable, and that such a broad view of history undervalues the fact that the bill's success was also so very dependent upon critical compromises among those in Washington, many of which, by the way, were accomplished in Dirksen's very own office. Understanding this aspect about our history can really help us to better understand the nature of how government works today. As I mentioned before, at that time, Everett Dirksen was serving as the Senate's minority leader, and even though he was a leader, that position is not a terribly powerful one traditionally. But in this case, because Southern Democrats held tremendous power to sabotage the legislation that was so important to both Lyndon Johnson as well as Everett Dirksen, it was up to Senator Dirksen to help assemble that bipartisan coalition of supporters who could overcome that threat. Unfortunately, Dirksen brought many formidable talents to the task. Although in the end, the battle was still very hard fought and extremely hard won. For Dirksen's indispensable role in the bill's success, he was featured on the cover of Time magazine in June of 1964, and in many ways, he has remained a face of this important chapter in our nation's history. And to think that such an important part of that story started right here in Central Illinois is truly something. I think about this all of the time, being from Pekin myself. It's impactful to me to understand and to believe that Dirksen would likely attribute his success to being from a place like Pekin, rather than to say that he achieved his success in spite of being from a place like Pekin. And in announcing his candidacy for a third term in the US Senate, Dirksen had this to say about Pekin. He said, "All the major decisions in my life have been made here." And then he went on to cite a long list of those major decisions. And then he ended his remarks in saying, "The inspiration which I received here from a saintly mother, a devoted family, steadfast friends, the constant faith of teachers who taught me, the inspiration I found here in church, the atmosphere of a quiet and well-ordered community, were the forces which helped to fashion those decisions. And for these, I shall always be eternally grateful." I think that Dirksen's story is really such a great inspiration. It's such a great American story. And it's a reason why we all of great Midwestern communities can be so proud to call them home. So with that, I will conclude my organized remarks, but as you know, I am more than happy to continue the conversation through answering questions or maybe touching further upon something that you want to hear more about. I'm trying to see if I can access the chat here. I can, but I don't see anything in there. So if anybody has something that they want to contribute. Donna, is this the only way that folks can ask questions, or can they turn their mics on and do that?
They cannot turn their mics on,
Okay.
but they can post questions in the Q&A or in the chat. Either way,
Okay.
we will see them and check them. I neglected to ask that at the beginning in my effort to try to remember the survey. So we'll give folks a few minutes to do that. And your presentation was so engaging. I think it takes time for people to come up with something.
Sure.
Now that they can step away from it a little bit. You know, many of the things you mentioned about his life in Pekin and with a wonderful family and the hardships at the beginning. Actually, he had hardships a lot. I mean, it wasn't just the loss of his father, and then I believe his brother was ill.
Yes.
And then he had, you know, he was a veteran in the First World War, and then he was a person who represented a small family business with the bakery. And then, you know, he went into local politics. He had one of those kinds of lives that always seemed to be based on working hard and just a regular kind of guy. And it just continued to grow step by step through hard work, but not necessarily political zeal. Can you talk to that point?
Yeah, you know, I think the thing that is so brilliant, and I don't know to what extent he intentionally manifested this, right? But he had this unique combination of having been from a humble upbringing. He was a working man. I mean, he was just an everyday type of person who I think that the average American, certainly in the Midwest, could relate to. He had like a folksiness about him because of that. But he also simultaneously possessed a great talent for speaking. And he was naturally drawn to knowledge and to learning. I mean, he was just a great student, and he could not get enough of school. He loved school. It was such a blessing to him to be able to go to high school. And, you know, he graduated top of his class, and he was on the debate team, and he played sports. So these two assets of his, the sort of hard knock life and the folksiness and the relatability of him, paired with the fact that he could get up in front of an audience and speak so eloquently and so intelligently on really complicated issues. It was just a great combination of traits that made him well-rounded, and I think gave him a broad appeal to many audiences. So that's what I would say about that. I do see a question here in the chat. Did Senator Dirksen ever aspire to an executive position, governor and or president? Yes, he did. He actually ran for president in 1948, I believe. So it was toward the end of his career in the House of Representatives. He sought the Republican nomination, and there's a great photo that I have of Dirksen supporters who are all blue-collar people putting up a big billboard at the entrance to Pekin that said, you know, Everett Dirksen for president. He did not get very far in that pursuit. And there was a time in his Senate career where he could have potentially been tapped for vice president, but these things are so complicated, and there were a lot of factors that just went into that not happening for him. So in short, to answer your question, yes, he did pursue an executive office. And part of that was because of these parallels that he drew between himself and Lincoln. I mean, he really, to that extent, thought that Lincoln's path was his path. And that encouraged him in part to try his hand at the presidency, although I think that he was pretty realistic about the likelihood that that would go very far. And it didn't, but nonetheless, that is on his resume.
And it was part of the contribution to his further success, because it was just one more experience that I think he had, you know, to build on. Patrick has in the, where are we, in the Q&A, what years did Mr. Dirksen serve in the U.S. House and then in the U.S. Senate?
So he was elected to the United States House of Representatives in 1929. And then he ran first in 1929, wasn't elected until 1931. Then in 1948, here's a little story, but I have to tell it because it's a good one that goes with the theme of my presentation. He decided not to run for re-election to the House because he was having issues with his eyesight. He describes it as he had spider webs in his eyes, and it was making it hard for him to read. And of course, the more he read, the worse it became. And he was enjoying a successful career in the House. He was really, really well respected, and he feared that his career was just going to go downhill if he couldn't read, and he didn't want to keep it up. He wanted to end on a high note, and so he made the very difficult decision to not run for re-election, and everybody tried to get him to change his mind, and he didn't. Instead, he sort of retreated for about 6 months to a country home. He rested, he didn't work very much, he didn't read very much. And he saw doctors, and he got multiple opinions on what was going on. And each doctor said that his left eye had to be removed, that there was something going on that was eventually going to spread to his right eye, and he would ultimately be completely blind. And his last opinion he got from a doctor at Johns Hopkins. And he tells the story about sitting in the office, listening to that opinion. And then he kind of asked for a moment to himself in which he recounts having a conversation with God. And God told him, don't let them remove that eye. And so the doctor comes back, and Dirksen thanks him, and he says, look, I trust your opinion. I'm sure that it is, you know, of the highest, most capable professional opinion, but I had a conversation with the man upstairs, and we're just not going to do it. And I thank you for your time. So he retreats to his country home, he rests, the problem goes away, and it never comes back ever again. And so he decided to get back into politics, but instead of running for the House, he said, you know what, I think that I'm supposed to be in the US Senate. And he ran for the US Senate against an incumbent who was the majority leader. It would be the equivalent of somebody running against Senator Richard Durbin today and winning. That's what Dirksen did. And he was elected in 1950 and started serving in 1951. And I love that story because I don't know that he would have ever run for the Senate if not for him deciding to take a break from the House of Representatives. And of course, if you weren't in the Senate at the time that he was there, who knows what the future of civil rights might have been. So he served in the Senate until 1969 when he died of post-surgical complications for some issues he was having with his lungs. I don't know if he was ever diagnosed with cancer, but he was a 3-pack-a-day smoker and, worked 18 hours a day, and he was hard on his body. And, ultimately when he was in his early 70s, that caught up with him and he passed away in 69.
Remarkable story. Before we answer a question that is in the chat about the center, could I ask a couple more questions about
Yes.
the senator? What I've read is that he had several streaks of being extremely conservative and then other streaks of being able to support civil rights and his friend LBJ. He seemed, well, I'd like you to tell me what you think that means. It seems that he was a very principled person and really didn't let labels get in the way. Can you speak to that?
I can. There are a number of ways in which we could unpack this phenomenon about Dirksen, but perhaps the most salient underlying factor here is that Dirksen would say openly to anybody that he held any idea in his head only tentatively, which meant that he was flexible. And he got a lot of criticism for this, especially in his early days in the Senate. And people would get frustrated with him for this. He's famous for saying that I am a man of fixed and unbending principles, the first of which is to be flexible at all times. And so he just kind of, he expressed that instinct to be flexible and to change his mind for various reasons, whether it be just because, circumstances changed or he had new information. He got to a point where he was able to do that without being threatened politically in terms of re-election. So there are lots of examples in his career of him being very unpredictable. And to some degree, he was a little bit of a chameleon to the times. He evolved, issues evolved. He would see the writing on the wall with things, and rather than fight against them, he'd say, I'm going to get on board with this because this is where the country is moving. If I fight against it, then I won't have any opportunity to influence it. And so he was much more adept to sort of moving downstream and making sure that he had a seat at the table to at least ensure that some of his principles, if not all of them, were able to be applied to legislation. But, the civil rights issue was one, again, I have to be careful not to apply the lens of today to the lens of yesterday. Republicans don't any longer have a positive reputation on progressive issues, which civil rights typically tends to fall in the category of. But again, because of this Lincoln issue that I talked about in my presentation, at the time, civil rights really was kind of a Republican thing. And so I don't know that it's fair to say that Dirksen or other Republicans were being extremely moderate on this issue. It was just a unique point in time where bipartisanship was possible because of these unique coalitions between Democrats and Republicans in the North. And they were just able to overpower the interests and the efforts of Republicans and Democrats in the South.
Yeah, it's just remarkable is really the only word. It leaves me speechless. We have two other questions about Senator Dirksen in the chat. Mark asks, what were your impressions of how Senator Dirksen has been portrayed in recent plays or movies about LBJ?
Well, I'm embarrassed to say that I don't know that so I know that there's been at least one rather recent movie about Johnson, and I've not seen either of them. So if somebody could, let's come back to that question. And if somebody could maybe fill me in on what the portrayal was, then I might be able to speak to that a little bit. Or Donna, do you know maybe what's being referred to?
I don't. I'm
Okay.
on your side. I'm waiting to be enlightened also. So
Okay.
please share that with us in the chat, and we'll move on to the next question to allow a little typing time.
Yeah.
Stephen asks, are there any biographies on Senator Dirksen that you would recommend?
Yeah, so perhaps there are many, but perhaps the best, most well-written and comprehensive one is by Neil McNeil, and that is called Portrait of a Public Man. Neil McNeil served as the congressional correspondent for Time magazine throughout the 1960s, and so he extensively covered Dirksen's career in that capacity. And they had developed such a good rapport that McNeil ended up writing his biography, and they started working on it when Dirksen was still alive. And interestingly enough, we have McNeil's papers here at the center. And this is a good segue into another question about research that's being supported by the center. So, Neil McNeil, of course, covered Dirksen, but he covered all of Congress throughout what ended up being one of the most impactful decades in U.S. history. And so Neil McNeil's collections, which we have here at the center, are fairly popular because their use is so widespread. Now, I came to the center right before COVID hit, and so there hasn't been a lot of in-person research done here. But right before COVID, we had a researcher here by the name of Tim Naftali. He is a very accomplished political scientist. He's got articles all over the place in Time and The Atlantic. He's written books. He currently serves, I think, as the chairperson of the political science department at NYU. He's got degrees from Harvard and Yale and Johns Hopkins. And he, in addition to all of that, was a former director of the Nixon Presidential Library. And because of that position that he held, and because he specializes in presidential history, during the Trump presidency around impeachment time, he was a frequent contributor on the major news networks like CNN, because they wanted to talk about impeachment and the history of impeachment in this country, and how the Trump impeachment was similar but different from other impeachment efforts. Obviously, Nixon didn't get to that point, but he was on his way to that point. And so Tim Naftali came to the center here to access the McNeil papers because he's writing a book on Ted Kennedy, and it'll probably be a widely available book, one that you could find in your bookstores, not something published in an academic journal that nobody sees. But that's an example of what I would call, a high-profile researcher who is coming all the way from New York to Pekin, Illinois, to do research on his project. Something that the center is utilizing its resources for, and this is a center-initiated project, is that we're actually going to be publishing a book-length publication that examines the Republican-led U.S. Senate during the Trump presidency. And, regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum or what your opinions are, the fact of the matter is that the Senate operated in a very unique way throughout the past 4 years. And in some ways, they failed to carry out some of their basic responsibilities. And the relationship between Mitch McConnell and President Trump and the strategies that were being employed, they're going to hold a unique place in history. And so the center recognizes that this is a body of work that really needs to be extensively examined, and not just by political scientists who can only look at things from, the 800-foot view, but by journalists, by current and former members of Congress, perhaps their staff. And so we have partnered with an editor who is also a successful author who has been studying the U.S. Senate for the past 25 years. And he's going to work with us to put together what I hope will be a really important piece of work, and should be out for publication in 2023.
Wow, exciting.
Yeah.
I do have another question about the center, but before we answer that, let's go back to the chat. Mark says that the play that he attended, All the Way, portrayed, let's see, I think Everett, he means Everett Dirksen, as a person who enjoyed hearing the sound of his own voice, and that the portrayal of LBJ was one in which he appealed to Senator Dirksen's ego. What do you think?
I would say that's accurate. Dirksen did have a little bit of an ego, and he admits this in his own autobiography, that especially for a small town boy going to Washington and experiencing the gravitas and the respect that people paid to him, that was appealing to him. And that seems egotistical and self-centered, and perhaps it was, but Dirksen was the first one to admit that felt kind of nice. He appreciated feeling important. And yes, he did have the reputation of being a person who liked to hear the sound of his own voice, and that's probably true as well. Like I said, this is a person who wanted to go into the theater, and he used those skills to influence the Senate and the House of Representatives while he was there. He was always up for a speech, and he took it very seriously. And if you hear him speak and the things that he would say, he was always quoting scripture and philosophy. That was just a part of who he was. And to some degree, was probably a little egocentric. But yes, it's true that LBJ knew that it was going to be appealing to Dirksen to be able to play such an important role in something like this. So I would say, without having seen it, but the way that you're describing it, that sounds a lot like Dirksen, and it sounds like at least a piece of the relationship between Dirksen and LBJ.
One that they both were aware of, no doubt.
Absolutely.
Well, last call, folks, for questions or comments. I'll spend a minute now with Tiffany asking her one other question before we close out for the night. Yeah, at the library, we often have students, high school students, who are in to do research, and we try to encourage it. And they're at the very early stages in their life of learning how to use research, how to even think about it, where to find it. And, they start at their local library, and we encourage them to learn here, because once they leave this community, they will be on their own and at universities and life to try to find out more about many things. And so with that in mind, I wonder, since you have a facility that is primarily for people who are doing research, is there such a thing as regular person, regular student, non-researcher tours that might provide a look at a larger horizon of what's out there and what's available for students if they were to come on a quote unquote field trip?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not something that happens all of the time, but I am always open to giving tours to various groups and showing them what's here and talking about what we do. Our congressional collections are, geared toward professional academics, but that's not to say that if a capable high school student or even an undergrad student came here, that there wouldn't be something of use for them, with a little bit of guidance. I'm sure that our collections could be useful to them. We don't advertise it at that level, but sure, we have things here for everybody, and even for students who, okay, they want to do research, but maybe it's not the type of research where you're really digging into primary source documentation. The center has published, booklets that, sort of condense that information. It's a secondary source document, and that's in part because my predecessor was in fact a historian and an archivist, and that was how he spent a good portion of his time. And so he's put together a lot of stuff here at the center that we give away to people. I mean, we have publications here that cover a broad range of topics on Dirksen. Civil rights is, of course, a very prevalent one. But yes, we have things here for every age, and I'm always eager to accommodate anybody who wants to learn more about Dirksen or Congress in general.
And I think that just for them to realize that there is such a place, even if they never saw a printed word there or a primary document, just to know that there is such a place in Central Illinois, which is part of their, heritage, even if we're a little outside of Pekin. And I think it's important and a point of pride and something they should know.
Definitely. And it is, like I said, it is a world-class institution that is making nationwide impact. And so we're very proud of it, and appreciate you spreading the word about it too, because it's good to be proud of where you're from, even if we're just talking about the entire state.
That's right. Well, I don't see any more questions, although I'm sure we'll all have them as soon as we close out for the night. Tiffany, if you would provide me with the link to your video.
Yes,
and
I will.
Also send us again the biography that you recommended, Portrait of a Public Man.
Yes.
And any other links you'd like us to post. And for our audience, we will send those to you in your email. And
Great.
We will be posting this video by tomorrow. And I think that would be all we have to ask Tiffany for here. And with that, I will say, Tiffany, this has been wonderful, a really refreshing look at politics, past and present. And we hope you will, go on with this kind of programming. I'm so glad the IHC made it possible. And with that, I thank you again, and I thank our audience, and I'll turn it back to you for closing comments.
Yes, I'll just close by saying thank you as well, and to clarify that you are welcome to share my contact information with anybody who is in your network in case folks want to reach out. I always have people after these presentations who reach out to me personally with questions or comments or stories that they have about Dirksen that I'm always eager to learn. So you do have my permission to share all of my contact information.
Well, I'm sure that you will be getting questions. Thank you so much again, Tiffany.
You're
And
so
with that,
welcome.
we'll
Take
say
care, everyone.
good night.
Good night.